Good evening, my dear friends. I hope you're all doing very well. Tonight we're going to be learning chapter 18 in the laws of Shabbat, and we're going to be learning in regards to when a person takes something out from one domain to another domain, as we've been learning over the last couple of days, quite deeply and really getting into it. We're going to learn what does it mean that someone takes something from one place to another. What does he actually have to transfer? What is the amount that a person actually has to take from one place and take it to another place to be liable? In other words, if a person just takes a blade of grass and walks with it from one place to another place, would they be liable? It's something which is not necessarily usable. Or is it usable? So the Rambam comes and gives us in this chapter everything that we have to know in regards to what you would be liable on if you were to transfer it. In other words, what is the amount that we have to transfer in order to be liable? So the Rambam says that a person who transfers an article from a private domain into a public domain, or the other way around, would only be liable in a case where the amount of the thing that they have transferred is beneficial. In other words, you're able to accomplish something with this that you have transferred this thing from one place to another place. Meaning, if you take something which there is now, you can't do anything with this thing that you have moved, well then, you wouldn't be liable. So let's see. When we're talking about food, so food is something which we transfer all the time. We always move food or things that are edible for human beings. On Shabbat, if a person transfers something which is edible, something which is food, that is going to be the size of a dried fig. Minimum. So in other words, the minimum amount that a person might transfer on Shabbat and would be liable would be if they transfer something which is the size of a dried fig, and this can be a combination of different foods together. Doesn't matter what it is, if it's any type of food, if it's the size of a dried fig, then the person would be liable. When we're talking about wine, so since wine has a certain, it's very strong and you can dilute it and it would still be considered as a drink, so it's a third of a revi'it. A revi'it is 86 milliliters, which is 3 ounces. So, meaning 1 ounce of wine, would a person be considered liable if they would transfer it. So 1 ounce is not a lot, but that's how much it is. If we're talking about oil, so oil can be either used to drink, or to use for cooking and so on, or it can also be used for smearing and so on, to anoint. So in such a case, oil would be, and you only need enough oil, which is actually a very small amount, to anoint the small toe of a newborn infant. In other words, in order to do something with oil that it should actually be of use, that's the minimum amount that you can use to smear it onto someone to make their skin better. A newborn baby's toe. That's the smallest amount. And honey, if a person wants to apply honey to a wound, so that's going to be a certain amount of honey, very small, but it has to be an amount that would work. All other liquids, so blood, water, so on and so forth, and would all be 3 ounces, which is a revi'it, which is 3 ounces. That's the amount of a revi'it of the biblical measurement. So in such a case, that's when you would be liable. How about food which is not for human consumption? So for instance, for animals, if we have grain or we have straw. So the Rambam says, if we're talking about straw, that would be, you need to transfer the amount that would fill the mouth of a cow. In other words, it's 1 mouthful of a cow's eating. If we're talking about straw from beans, that would be for the mouthful of a camel, etc. And if we're talking about grass, then it has to be the size of feeding it to a goat, which eat grass. But if we're talking about onion leaves or garlic leaves, so these are actually edible, so then it has to be the size of a dried out fig, as we already mentioned. And how about wood? Wood is something which is not eaten by people. It's not eaten by animals, but we use it in order to cook things, to light a fire. So what is the minimum measure that one would be liable if they transferred wood? So the Rambam says that it would be the amount necessary to cook a portion of a chicken's egg. And the egg has to be the size of a dried fig. So if you would place that in a pot and you needed to heat up the fire, so then that would be the amount of wood that you would need in order to be liable for transferring on Shabbat, so that you can actually cook something. I mean, an egg is a very small thing, but it's a certain amount of wood. Now, this is an interesting thing. The Rambam talks about spices. Now, spices, even the minutest amount of spice is already going to add. So therefore, any type of spice, if we're talking about pepper or so on and so forth, would be even the slightest amount, we already would be liable on its transfer. And also in regards to a fragrance, something which makes a good smell, even the smallest amount would already make a difference, would already be a pleasure. Or if it's a bad fragrance, it would also be not good. Or if you need it for something, so then again, fragrance, any type of fragrance would be even on the minutest amount. When we're talking about metals, this is interesting. If we're talking about hard metals, for instance, bronze or iron, and so on and so forth, and I would imagine this would also apply to gold and silver. Again, it's the slightest amount, we would already be liable. If a person takes a coal, so again, the slightest amount, because you would be able to light a fire from that. But a person who transfers a flame on Shabbat, they are not liable. So this is an interesting thing. So the Rambam says if a person transfers a flame, just the actual flame, and the commentators talk about this, and it's brought down in the Talmud, and a person would not be liable if they were able to transfer a flame on Shabbat. The thing is that it's only if you transfer a flame. If you transfer a coal that has a flame, you would be liable because you're transferring the coal. And so on. Or a piece of wood that is burning. So then again, that person would be liable because of taking out a piece of wood. So it's only if they're able to transfer just the flame on its own. I'm not really sure how that works. We can ask our scientists in our midst. How about seeds? So the Rambam says that seeds that are not for human consumption. So for instance, if we're talking about cucumber seeds that are made for planting, or so on and so forth. So in such a case, we would need 2 seeds. 2 seeds is the amount that you need in order to start a plant. That's how the Rambam says. And therefore, you would need to take 2 seeds and then be liable. But if we're talking about seeds for human consumption, so then we're talking about 5 seeds. So the Rambam puts this number to it, that 5 seeds is the amount of seeds that a person would eat. I guess if you snack on sunflower seeds or something, 5 seeds is the amount of actually be considered something of food. If we're using it for burning, if we're burning with these seeds, so then again, as we mentioned before, burning needs to be enough to cook this, partially cook this egg in its pot. And so on and so forth. If we're talking about an animal eating these seeds, well then again, it would have to fill the mouth, one mouthful of an animal. Over here he says that it would be a goat. In our case, in regards to seeds, I guess they eat seeds more. So, how about ink? Person transfers ink on Shabbat. What amount would they have to be liable for if they transferred it? So the Rambam says it has to be enough ink to write 2 letters. But if a person didn't transfer enough ink to write 2 letters, so then they will not be liable. If a person transfers one ink for 1 letter and then he goes back and transfers ink for another letter, again, they would not be liable because you've already transferred the first letter and it's been written, so to speak. How about if a person takes, like, calls it eye paint, but I guess type of makeup paint or eyeliner and so on, whether it's for cosmetic purposes or for medicinal purposes, medical purposes, in whatever case, he says, if in the society where this person is living, there is a custom of painting also just one eye, so then that will be enough to make the person liable. But if it's in that culture, if the place where the person lives, it's only the practice is only to decorate both eyes, so then it has to be the amount of decorating painting 2 eyes. How much clay? So he says enough to make a seal for a letter. And if a person is taking rope, that would have to be enough to make a handle for a container. So again, we have all these different things, many, many different things. The Rambam goes through and he lists them out, really explaining us that it has to be something which, if we transfer these things, it's going to be something that we can use. There is actually going to be purpose to this thing that has been transferred. It's not just a blade of grass, as I spoke about it right in the beginning. In such a case, a person wouldn't be liable because you can't really do anything with that blade of grass. And even if we're talking about a garment, a piece of cloth, there has to be a certain size in order for the person to be liable if they transferred it. And that size is not very large, but 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths. So it's just about this size. But if it's just a little ripped off piece, something which is really small, and there's nothing you can really do with it, so then no. If we're talking about a piece of leather, so in a case of leather, you would need a little bit more than that. It's actually 5 handbreadths by 5 handbreadths, so that's actually quite big. By the way, all of these numbers, which we're talking about over here, the Rambam himself didn't make them up. Neither did the rabbis of the Talmud. It's just an important thing to mention. And the Rambam mentioned this earlier on, that all of these numbers were passed down from Moses when he came off Mount Sinai and was teaching the laws of the Torah. These numbers came along, and this is how he taught it. So, again, this was all passed down orally from Moses on Mount Sinai, exactly in regards to what a person would be liable on Shabbat and what would not be. So it's just an important thing to mention. How about parchment? Piece of paper. How much parchment would a person need to transfer in order to be liable? He says, in order to write the first portion of the Shema. If we're talking about the type of parchment that you can write on it a mezuzah, so then it has to be enough to write a mezuzah on it. Animals. Are you allowed to carry an animal on Shabbat in a public domain? Yeah, your dog gets tired, you want to lift it up, you want to carry it. No, you're not allowed to, because even if though they are alive, or live animals, still you're not allowed to. People, on the other hand, Rambam says, and this is a concept which is brought down in Jewish law, is that people are not considered a burden, so to speak. Not in the regards of being. There's a concept called a living creature carries itself, and there are different discussions on exactly the way this works, because technically also animals carry themselves, but still a person is in regards to Jewish law, it comes out that a person, since the person carries himself, so therefore, if the person is able to walk on their own and they're able to move around, so then if a person carries them, we would not be liable for carrying them. But if the person was tied up, or the person was very sick and they couldn't walk on their own, so then someone who carries them would be liable because they now are a weight and a burden which you're carrying. And even if a person is carrying a baby on Shabbat, if the baby is holding something, the baby has a purse hanging around its neck or so on and so forth, so then they would be liable because they're actually transferring something along with it. But if it's a grown-up person, even if the person has rings on their hands and so on and so forth, they would not be liable because this person is able to carry themselves. On the contrary, a baby cannot carry themselves. So it's actually a very interesting thing in the way this would work, and there's a discussion in Jewish law in regards to a baby. If a baby, just generally speaking, since the baby is alive, but the baby can't walk, how would this work in regards to Shabbat? Slightly beyond the discussion over here, but it's just something to pick up on and note that there are those that say that on Shabbat you are allowed to carry a baby. There are those that say that you cannot, but that's just generally. And again, obviously, if a person doesn't have to carry another human being on Shabbat, it's obviously better. In other words, if a person does carry someone, they wouldn't be liable, but doesn't necessarily mean that you're allowed to do it right off the bat, so to speak. So that's just an important thing to note. Now the Rambam goes into a whole different topic in regards to someone who transfers half, or in other words, less than the prescribed measure of a certain substance. So in other words, if we said that you're only going to be liable if you transfer 3 ounces of liquid, in most cases, what happens if you transferred 2 ounces, or maybe 1.5 ounces? So the Rambam says that in such a case, the person would not be liable. In other words, if it's less, you're not liable. Now the thing is that if you went and you transferred 1/2, and you've transferred it, and then you went back and you transferred another half, in such a case you would be liable because you've actually taken the entire 2 halves, you've taken them both to the same destination. So that wouldn't help. The person would be liable. But if you take 1/2 to one place and the other half to another place, then the person would not be liable because you're not coming to the same destination. Then there's a very interesting concept. If someone takes something which is a portion of food which is the size of a dried fig, right? That the person would be liable for that. But before he places it down, it actually diminishes in its size. So it's like it suddenly became, it became all shriveled up. Would you be liable or not? So it goes according to when you put it down. If at the time when you put it down, it had the size of a fig, so then you would be liable. If it didn't, even if in the beginning, even if when you picked it up, it had the size of a fig, and now when you put it down, it doesn't, you would not be liable. So to also in regards to when you're putting it down, maybe if you changed your mind, you took out something for the purpose of eating, but then when you put it down, you had in mind that it should be for planting. So you took out 3 seeds. 3 seeds is not enough for a person for eating. We said that it would have to be 5 seeds. When you put it down, you actually, you know what? How about I plant these and I make something grow out of it, which you only need 2 seeds in order to plant. In such a case, you would be liable because when you put it down, you had it in mind for something which you would be liable for. And the Rambam completes this chapter by saying that if a person transfers less than the standard measure of substance, as we said, in other words, the person takes out less than what we will be liable for, but he takes it in another vessel. It can be a glass, it can be anything. The vessel is going to be nullified in regards to the thing that is inside it. So in other words, if you have a glass and you have within it 2 ounces, and you transfer these 2 ounces within this glass, you would not be liable, even though you transferred an entire glass, which is something which is very large, or even if in a big pot. The pot would be nullified in regards to the liquid which is in there, because, in other words, you are trying to move the water, not the glass, not the vessel which is in it. And therefore, you would not be liable on the item, and you're not liable on the food, on this liquid, because it's less than the amount that you would be liable for. So that is the chapter for today. It's actually quite interesting, with some numbers and details, but the idea of what a person would be liable for, what is the minimum amount that they have to actually transfer. So that is the chapter for today. My friends, we are more than halfway through the laws of Shabbat. We're moving along. We'll see you all tomorrow.